Colossal barrier was not worth the toll it inflicted on the Chinese people. Once again, his enemies were plotting against him.
Shi Huangdi's final years were marked by what I think is reasonable to call paranoia. But as the old joke says, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you.
At least 3 assassination plots came very close to succeeding. Shi Huangdi struck back by turning China into a virtual prison for its people. He ordered all historical records of his ruthless regime destroyed. Punishment for anyone who didn't comply was forced labor or even death. Some 400 people were buried alive as a lesson to those who spoke out against the regime. When the emperor's eldest son objected, even he was banished. Shi Huangdi's brilliant vision had transformed China into a great empire, but he paid the price with a descent into madness. He would now turn his obsessions and his army of forced labor to another stunning feat of construction begun years earlier. A monument to his own fear and death. In the 1040s, movable type printing was invented in China, a huge development in the history of printing. By 220 BC, Qin Emperor Shi Huangdi has united China for the first time. On the northern border, millions are toiling and dying, laying the foundation for China's signature engineering triumph. The 3,000-mile-long Great Wall. But the first emperor wasn't done. Even as he fought against other Chinese kingdoms and his own demons, Shi Huangdi began to garrison nearly 700,000 men near his capital in central China to build the most personal of all his engineering projects, an epic tomb he had begun planning at the age of 13.
This was a monumental project that required the labor of thousands and thousands of people over a very long time. It was, by design, the biggest and best tomb that China had ever known.
In 1974, farmers digging a well came face to face with an ancient Chinese warrior. The mysterious terracotta skull would prove the gateway to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time.
The mound is huge. The mound was always known to be the tomb mound of the first emperor. What was a total surprise was the army of terracotta warriors about a kilometer to the east of the tomb, who presumably were guarding the approach to the tomb itself.
Season after season of excavation since the 1970s has yielded more than 5 large pits.
The individualized faces and drapery and armor suggest that each one of these warriors was molded from the life from an individual, separate human being. The precision and detail in the sculpting, the firing of the clay are unmatched today. These warriors are a colossal achievement, and some believe the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. But they are only the tip of the iceberg, because this ghost army only served as a guard detail for an engineering feat as fantastic as the world has ever known, the opulent tomb of Shi Huangdi.
Each statue stands between 5 feet 8 inches and 6 feet 2 inches tall, giants for the time. Some weighed up to 600 pounds. But it was the terracotta itself that sent shockwaves through the teams excavating the site. The clay had a hardness beyond anything they'd ever seen before, indicating that Shi Huangdi's artisans had developed a revolutionary new technology, blast furnace kilns that fired the statues at temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Archaeologists eventually uncovered 3 massive pits filled with the terracotta army guarding the first emperor's tomb. One pit alone contains over 6,000 life-size warriors and horses in battle formation. In a second pit, 1,300 of Shir Huangdi's elite military forces, including archers, chariots, and cavalry, were discovered, while the third pit, with 68 figures and 1 chariot, was the command center of the entire army, headquarters for the defense of Shir Huangdi's empire, even in death.
The military armor is fairly specific. We can tell that the armor used was lacquered leather. We can see that people had cleats on the bottom of their boots to help them run in the mud. We can see the kinds of caps people wore and associate them with rank.
30-foot walls divided the massive complex, which stretches out for 7,000 yards into 3 parts, the outer city and inner city, and then the mausoleum itself. During construction of the tomb, an army of workers excavated a gigantic terraced pit measuring about 1,600 feet by 1,700 feet, equal to 580 basketball courts. When the sprawling tomb complex was complete, it was topped with a terraced mountain of earth, nearly 400 feet tall. At the time, it may have been nearly as large as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. But over 2,000 years, weather has worn down the original man-made mountain to about 250 feet.
It's hard to believe that something like that could be purely the product of human labor, but it is. That mound was put there, basket full of earth after basket full of earth, to cover what we assume is an entire underground city dedicated to the afterlife of the first emperor.
Shir Huangdi's tomb is definitely the expression of a guy who wanted his empire to blow away everything the world had ever known. The ceiling is said to be a night sky studded with constellations made out of pearl. The floor, an entire recreation of his empire in miniature with pavilions and pagodas by a flowing river of mercury. The king himself laid out in gold and jade in a bronze coffin floating on a pool of mercury. Now, all this is pretty fantastic and mind-blowing, but is it true? Well, scientific tests have proven mercury levels 100 times the norm around the mountain, and ground-penetrating radars detected a room inside the mountain 33 feet high. So the emperor's tomb may be all it's cranked up to be, but we're gonna have to wait to find out, because the Chinese government has decided not to excavate the place until they have the technology to preserve what's inside. And even then, once they go in, it may be a very treacherous dig.
There were corridors and trapdoors and booby traps that were designed to prevent tomb robbing. Now, we assume that those are no longer operable after a couple thousand years, but I'm sure whoever goes into that tomb first is going to step carefully.
Shir Huangdi had boasted the Qin dynasty would last 10,000 generations, but just 3 years after his mysterious death, the vast empire collapsed. The first emperor paid a steep price for his epic engineering projects. The Great Wall and magnificent tomb bankrupted the country and ultimately broke the backs of China's peasants. Pushed to their limits, the people revolted, and China was plunged into chaos. Shir Huangdi is said to have died from ingesting mercury, which he believed to be an elixir of immortality. Shir Huangdi, the first emperor of a united China, is dead. Few mourn. Many have eagerly anticipated an end to the hated and ruthless Qin dynasty. A vicious power struggle ensued for control of the empire.
In a word, it was chaotic. Very quickly, after the death of Tian Huangdi, things fell into civil war with various people vying for power.
206 BC, a new ruler comes to power determined to bring stability to China. His name was Liu Bang, a former soldier and cunning politician who knew how to win the hearts and minds of the people. Over the next 4 years, Liu Bang consolidated his rule and rallied the people behind him, peace and stability returned to the empire. By the time he died in 195 BC, he had launched a dynasty that would thrive for nearly 4 centuries, the Han. The Han embarked on a wall-building campaign even more massive than Shi Huangdi's.
They extended the Great Wall much further to the west than it had been, and set up a set of garrisons and a series of watchtowers that guarded the trade routes out into Central Asia for hundreds of miles to the northwest of the capital.
The Han built their fortresses at closer intervals than earlier dynasties, every 1 to 3 miles. In areas of heavy enemy activity, that could increase to only 500 yards apart. Han soldiers had 3 critical missions along the wall: defend against invasion, gather military intelligence on enemy activity, and keep the vital beacon towers maintained and supplied with beacon fire fuels.
Han Dynasty signal towers incorporated several sorts of alarms. Flags and smoke were only used in the daytime. Torches were only used at night. Bigger bonfires and drums were used at any time. And complex codes were devised for these signals. And just like today, modern codes, they were all classified as top secret and unknown to the public. From around 200 BC to 200 AD, just about the time that Rome was dissolving as a republic, only to be reborn as an empire that would gobble up and transform the Western world, China was an empire that was consuming and transforming the East. During the Han Dynasty, the population of China grew to 50 million people. The empire went as far south as Vietnam, as far west as Afghanistan. It was massive. But after 400 years, just like Rome, internal disintegration started to overshadow military success, and in 184 AD, a peasant rebellion brought the Han Dynasty to a screeching halt. And once again, China was on the verge of chaos.
For 3 centuries, warfare, treachery, and death were the rule in China. And once again, it took a ruthless hand to put an end to the time of turmoil. In the 6th century, a northern people, the Sui, declared war on the chaos, conquering one part of the empire after another, until China was united again, for the first time since the Han Dynasty fell 3 centuries earlier. The Emperor Yangtze would build the Sui Empire on the foundation of nearly 1,000 years of dynasties that came before. Unlike previous emperors who had concentrated on fortifying China against the outside world, Yangtze would channel his energies inward and strengthen his empire within its borders. China is vast, and its waterways provided the most efficient means of transportation over such great distances. 2 major rivers traverse the country east to west, the Yangtze in the south and the Yellow River in the north, but they are 1,000 miles apart. China was a house divided. Yangtze decided to do something about that. He aimed to link northern and southern China by a gigantic central artery, a grand canal, a kind of hydraulic highway for merchants, soldiers, and citizens.
Very common to China in terms of constructing any large infrastructure project. They would look at existing waterways and try to find area where they could connect and link the entire canal. They want to take advantage of natural geography.
This gigantic construction project would take more than 1 million man-days of work, most of it digging. Living and working conditions were horrendous, harsh and primitive. Tens of thousands died of starvation, fatigue, and